Hello and welcome to Fast Talk, your source for the science of endurance performance. I'm your host, Rob Pickles, here with my co-host, the curious Canadian, Coach Trevor Connor. Many of us spend months training hard and planning perfectly for our big event. Everything goes well, and we reach the big week with the best legs we've ever had. And then, in those final few days, it all comes apart. This is a common story. Everyone on this week's episode had no problem sharing stories of an event they cared about being ruined in the days leading up to it. Event preparation is an important step in maximizing our potential, and in many ways, it's a skill that we need to develop and train. Our guest this week, head of sports science at Wahoo, is an elite coach who's worked with world champions and everyday athletes. He knows all too well what's involved in getting an athlete ready for race day, particularly when they have to deal with travel and the stress of what could be the most important event of their careers. Neal shares with us his wisdoms on planning those final days, how to establish a routine, what sort of training to do, nutrition, warm-ups, and how to deal with travel. Along with Neal, we have a host of top experts share their thoughts on event preparation, including World Tour Pro with Trek Segafredo, Tom Skoinch, physiologist and head of performance for UAE Team Emirates, Dr. Inigo San Milan, author of The Athlete's Gut, Dr. Patrick Wilson, CTS Premier Coach Renee Eastman, and top cyclocross rider and coach Rebecca Gross. So, fill up your water bottle, put your legs up, and let's make you fast. Listeners, we have an exciting announcement. We've lowered the price of membership by 75%. Now you can enjoy all the training science at Fast Talk Laboratories for just $60 a year. Join today at fasttalklabs.com/join. Neal Henderson, welcome to the show. And as the listeners know, I tend to gush about people because I have a lot of man crushes. And Neal might be the ultimate man crush. And I say that in great deference because Neal Henderson is the first person to give me my chance out of grad school. Neal was really my first sort of mentor. He hired me at Boulder Center for Sports Medicine. He taught me 105% of what I know. So we're lucky, you know, but I also think that Neal and Trevor and I were really aligned on having Neal here because the topic we're covering today, 4 days preparation before your event, is the perfect topic to cover with a coach who also has a sports science background. So we're really looking forward to the talk today.
Thank you, guys. And Rob, I actually just realized something. You were the first person that I actually interviewed via electronic means. We were actually on a Skype call.
We were on Skype.
Yeah, this is way before any of this stuff was necessary.
Before it was normal.
I mean, this was in the early 2000s,
Yep.
2019,
the 2000-aughts, we'll call them, I think.
Yep.
And so way before, 10 plus years before it was the standard way. So it's pretty cool to be here with you and with Trevor and to be able to talk about some of this stuff.
And full disclosure, I might have been across the country in Lake Placid, New York.
Yep. And I was in Boulder.
Yeah, but I really only had a button-up shirt on the top, and I was definitely wearing like shorts or something on the bottom. And
flip-flops.
Exactly. But I'm glad that we're here together today.
Well, Neal, you didn't give me my first shot out of grad school, so welcome, I guess.
Yeah. I'm here for you too, Trevor.
Oh, you are. Actually, you know what? I was riding with Rio and manager of Rio out of grad school, and you were our coach. So I got to take that back. You were great. So appreciate it and always love having you on the show. So, Rob, where do we want to start here?
I think that the idea is this. We talk so much about training. We talk so much about all of the things that you can do to improve your performance. But what happens when the hard work is over? What happens in those final days before the event where you're just trying to not screw up all of the hard work that you did? How the heck can you apply a strategy that makes you better or optimizes your performance in the few days leading up to a race?
And let's just emphasize that because I have seen a whole lot of athletes that spend months doing the perfect preparation, and then they're 4 days out from the event. They get nervous. They get into that exam, I got to cram mode, and undo all that training in 4 days. And Neal, looking at the way you're nodding your head, You've seen that a lot
You've seen it before.
It's amazing. There's actually a phenomenal runner from the U.S. who kind of ended his career during a taper. So big picture, we always think about, you have to back off your training to be able to be ready to perform at your best. So you can't keep training at your highest level all the way up to race day. So there's always going to be some reduction. There's a few different ways. There's lots of research out there on tapering strategies. I would say I tend to follow something more along the lines of about a 30% reduction 2 weeks out and about a 50% reduction kind of the week leading into an event, but it does definitely vary depending on the kind of event somebody's doing. But there is this reduction in training that you're doing. And so that leaves athletes feeling typically pretty good. And if you don't have a plan for what to do in those last few days, you might go off the rails. And this runner took on a massive landscaping project at home, had all kinds of time the week before the race, went out and basically dug up trees, moved rocks, and sustained an injury that pretty much ended their career. And this was, an Olympic level runner who just made a series of poor choices and didn't manage that taper period very well. So I think we can hopefully help some of you who, I don't know if you're going to the Olympics or not, but, help you not undo all the great work that you've done in your season or potentially even over your career and be able to have your best performance.
But hey, at least his yard looked great as he was sitting there recuperating.
Had lots of recovery time to enjoy that beautiful backyard. Brutal.
Oh, that's just painful to hear. I actually killed a target race just a couple of years ago. Chris and I were really focusing on the Sunshine Hill climb. Just for fun, the day before I went to...
Wait. Just for fun, the Sunshine Hill climb?
Yes.
Just for... I just go out and I do that for fun.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's you.
I don't get paid. Anything I do on the bike now is just for fun. So
my only experience with this, not that I want to derail it, is that where Neal and I used to work, Boulder Center for Sports Medicine, was literally the starting line of the Sunshine Canyon Hill climb. And I watched people line up for it.
Yep.
Never crossed my mind that I should race that.
Yeah.
But like Neal, I think we're more sprinters. As you know, Trevor, it does that climbing
Well,
thing.
the worst part of that is actually registration was at BCSM.
Yep.
And the segment on Strava was a little further down the road. So even though I did my fastest time ever up Sunshine, the 40 minutes I spent registering, standing around, waiting for the race to start, all counted towards my Strava segment. So it's actually my slowest time on Strava.
Man, that's a harsh reality coming at you there.
But here's my way of ruining that race. We were focusing on it. I was going to work for Chris to try to get him the win. And the day before, I went to a town north of Boulder called Fort Collins for a race up there. And a guy that, let's say, I've had a rivalry with for a long time broke away with another rider. And everybody's like, they're up the road. There's no way we can catch them. I'm like, not going to happen. I got on the front and did an hour and a half pull to bring that breakaway back. So the next day I get to the race and Chris is like, how are you feeling? I'm like, I'm not going to be able to help you at all.
I've never actually ruined my own race before a taper, but I have ruined somebody else's. A guest that we've had on the show, Dr. Jason Glowney, who I think that we're all familiar with. He and I used to ride a lot together. And one day I was feeling pretty good, pretty spicy. We were riding north of town on the flats, and he was sort of sitting on my wheel, which usually, let's be honest, I sat on his wheel. Typically, he's very strong. But I was feeling good, and so I dropped down into a semi-aero position. I had my forearms on my bars. And Glowney said, as soon as I saw you do that, I knew that tomorrow wasn't going to be much fun for me. And I proceeded to hammer as hard as I could. And he just tried to sit on my wheel, and we finished. And he was like, bro, man, I got a race tomorrow. And so unfortunately, I apologize, Dr. Glowney, if you're out there listening. It's all my fault.
Yep. And even though we might just talk about the last 4 or so days here before your event, I know I destroyed one of my Xterra World Championship races myself 7 days out. I was at Ironman Hawaii cheering on athletes that I was coaching and working with. And man, the motivation you get from seeing the best in the world out there competing in a world championship is absolutely hard to contain. And I was young. I was in my 20s. I was excited. I had placed second in my age group at Xterra World Championships the year before, which back then you had Ironman Hawaii, and then just a week later was the Xterra World Championships over in Maui. And so I was there in Kona, watched everyone Saturday, and Sunday I had my last kind of efforts to do. And I went so overboard because I was just so jacked up on watching everyone all Saturday. Also, I had been out there, in the sun for 10 hours on Saturday. I came into it probably less than rested. And I proceeded to just absolutely put on the workout of my life on Sunday. And the following Sunday on race day at Xterra Worlds, I was flat as could be. I went from second the year before, even with a flat tire on the bike that I fixed and rolling my ankle. I still finished second in my age group that year, where I went to Kona and watched everything and blew my race a week before. I finished fourth. Hard lesson to learn.
No bueno.
The wrong way.
I think that the takeaway out of all of this, right, is we've all been there. Every one of us have messed this up. I'm sure a lot of the listeners have. So how do we get around this? How do we prevent those last few days from undoing everything?
And you talked to us right before we went on the air. I think you called it your sequence.
Yeah, sequencing.
So tell us a little bit about this. So you create a whole plan for those final days for your athletes.
Yep. So the planning is really about helping an athlete be prepared both physically and mentally. And so the sequencing is a series of training sessions, but also other elements that we put into that schedule to take up some of that time that would normally be spent training. So great example of this, actually, with Rowan Dennis for his hour record. We went to a matinee movie one day. It was half an hour away from where we were staying. The movie itself was over 2 hours long, half an hour drive back. So that took 3+ hours of time in the middle of the day on what was scheduled to be a rest day, so that he wasn't just thinking about that. Because the one thing that often happens when you don't have a plan to do something else with your time is you fill it sometimes with just spinning your wheels in your head and thinking too much and getting in your head if you don't have really good foundation of mental training that you've been doing, and then you start to go into that place, oh my gosh, you can be in trouble. And some of that might be an elevation, an escalation of your energy inappropriately in the days leading up to it, which means then you're kind of empty on race day. I've seen that coaching collegiate athletes a lot of times. When I was coaching the CU triathlon team, we would go out to California for the national championships, which were there every year at the Wildflower Triathlon. We'd have athletes, we'd be leaving on Thursday and they were already at, 10 out of 10 level, and they dialed it up over the next 2 days on the drive out there. They get there, and then by the day before the race, they're coming off a high because they've just been so jacked, and they didn't manage that energy. And on race day, they were just flat because they literally had just been running that psychological side at maximum for days and then had nothing left when it really mattered. So sequencing is about having certain things that you're doing in training, but also making sure that you're addressing all the rest of the non-training time and making sure that there's attention being paid to that and discussed, not just letting it up to chance.
So is this something that you write out? Is this a plan that you create for each athlete?
So in a training schedule, there's certain components that we're going to practice this in advance of that, let's call it an A race, very high important race, whether that's a national championship or a qualifying event. We're going to go through this process typically a couple times in the lead up to that, starting many months out. And one of the best ways to do that is when you're doing some of your testing type efforts, just to see where your fitness is at. If it's kind of a power testing day that you're going to be doing, I will actually use the same sequencing in the last 3, 4, 5 days that they're going to use in their competition, and taking into account like when the travel days might be. So in some cases, you can just train, you travel 3 days, 3 days before it, you do opener and then race. That's a kind of typical standard if you're only traveling a couple hours. If you have a longer travel, it might be happening 5 days out is that travel day. And so we might take that day completely off and then think about, okay, riding easy and then doing some openers and event, having basically a schedule for that relative to actually what that travel schedule looks like. If you're doing big international travel, ideally, you want to have that scheduled earlier, but very often it's just a matter of what's available, flights, or what the timing of things is, what other events you've got going on, or work responsibilities that you can't leave until this point, or family. And so you may not be working in the ideal situation, but if you run through that consistent type of schedule in those days, you have a familiarity with it. And so there's not an absolute rigidity, but there's some consistency.
Let's hear from World Tour pro Tom Scoinch, who talked with us about the sequence he uses as he builds up to key events.
As pros, we do race a lot. It is really different for race to race. But if we are talking key races, then as with anything, you always try and look back from the race day, count kind of backwards. And usually in the perfect scenario, the day before would be a 2-hour ride with some harder efforts, maybe some sprints thrown in there as well for good measure, just to wake up the body, because the day before would have been a rest day or a very, very easy day. So it's at least 2 days of pretty easy training. And depending on how big the training sessions have been in, let's say, 10 days out, day 3 and 4 can be either, maybe day 4 would be still fairly intense, but short. Let's say some 3 hours or 4 hours, which is short for us, I guess, with some time behind the scooter. I am always one that enjoys, or not really enjoys, but benefits from the time behind a moto, from the time at speed, at race speed, because in training alone, it's hard to do it. And then, maybe that 3 days out would be just a leisurely, easy ride, but that would be longer than 2 hours, let's say 3 hours of just riding and enjoying hopefully some sunshine instead of some Belgian rain.
Is there anything you change about your sleep, your recovery, your nutrition?
Not really. I mean, for sure, especially if it's a big day coming, you definitely start making sure that you are fueling well enough 2 days out. You got to replenish the tank, especially for a race like Roubaix or something where you're on the pedals the whole day and it's, sometimes 7 hours on the bike. 3 days out, you can, maybe on that long ride, you can really not go crazy on ingesting a lot of carbs, sort of let that tank run lower. But that intense day, 4 or 5 days out that I would do behind the moto, I would make sure that I do pretty much the same fueling of, let's say, grams of carbs per hour that I would do in the race. Just so that the body remembers how to utilize the carbs that are given to it. Yeah, hit that 90 grams of carbs or whatever per hour. Maybe even eat some gels, maybe even take some caffeine gels, because that is, always comes in handy to make sure that hard sessions are hard and you feel good in them, not come back just wrecked.
It seems obvious to me, and I always bring up the one person that I coach, which is my wife. We build her training around that travel schedule. We get her used to sort of not necessarily being able to run much X days before. That's all built into training in the weeks prior.
Yep.
But this is a whole other level. I am so beyond impressed. Thank you.
Well, it's also really smart. I mean, I actually think, so one of my last big target races that I always look back on and go, was 2011 Canadian Nationals. I was on some of the best form in my life. In the previous year, I just missed a podium. So was feeling really good about this race. And it was near my parents' house. So I stayed at my parents' place and planned nothing for the 2 days before the race to get ready. And sitting around my parents' house doing nothing, I just got stressed. Because all I could do was think about the race. And I'm listening and going, that was so obvious. And why didn't I think of that? Just go to a movie.
Yep. You just pressurize yourself unnecessarily. You didn't have a relief valve planned.
Right.
And so that's one of those things. And in working with athletes, I always talk about in those final days, we're going to have a plan, but we have to be able to adapt. So having a plan is important. Being able to adapt is critical to success, because things are going to happen, whether it's based on the weather, logistics and things like that with the Olympic Games. Even though, there's a lot of things in preparation that happens, all of a sudden there's like, you can't do this now, or that can't happen at this time. And you need to be able to be, okay, we're going to do this then. And not, I want it this way. It's just not available. Like, we have to adapt and go forward. And that's really important part of learning how to be flexible, because the ideal preparation may look like something, the reality is something else. I remember with Flora Duffy several years ago when she was really kind of starting her rise in the ITU racing world, and she got food poisoning. She flew over to Sweden. She had won a race before that or had been on the podium, and she flew over and got sick. And it's like, okay, what do you do now? It's like, we're just going to rest for several days because you're depleted. Like any training you're going to do is only going to slow you down for those first 2 days. And she did a little bit of exercise basically the day before, nothing in the normal, but she ended up winning the next day because she just adapted, adjusted, and didn't stress about the things that weren't done, the things that weren't perfect, and just executed her race, and it worked out. And she took the ITU, lead after that event, which had never happened. I mean, it was an amazing ability. And that was over years of time that we developed that kind of a plan and ability to just adapt and adjust and trust. Trust is a big part of it.
I think athletes and coaches can both look at this adaptability and realize the importance, but also work with it, right? If you're an athlete, I understand if you have a routine. I know people, they're really rigid in that they have to listen to the exact same song at the exact same time because that's part of the preparation, and that gets them to 101%. But maybe what you need to do is practice not doing that, because a day is going to come where that is not going to happen because your phone died, because who knows what it is. But and then also on the coach, right? As coaches and as people, we're trying to work with athletes and say, hey, this is what's best. This is what I've researched. This is what I think that we ought to do. But maybe language shouldn't be absolute. This is the only thing. This is the absolute best way to do it. Because if that plan doesn't go, the athlete is going to be like, but you said why? Huh? And that could spin somebody out of control.
I think one of the ways you can help with that is, well, it's great to have this very detailed, do this 2 days before the event, do this 20 hours before the event, do this 18 hours before the event. As you said, it's not always going to play out that way. So understand what you're trying to accomplish and what the goals are. Like, I want to make sure my legs are rested, but not too rested, so I'm rusty.
Yep.
You have your goals for nutrition, have your goals for these different things, so that if you have to adjust, you still know what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, a lot of those things are developing confidence.
Yes. So with that, why don't we dive into some of these different aspects? And so let's say 3-4 days out from the event. So training is over. You're not going to get any stronger. You have what you have. What should you be doing in terms of continuing to, let's say, exercise? So runner, cyclist, triathlete, whatever your sport is, what should you be doing in those 4 days to have your body ready?
Yep. From that point, there's typically going to be a complete relative rest day. And that relative rest does vary. That might be a complete day off for a lot of folks. For a lot of amateur athletes, they're used to having a day off, once a week or every couple of weeks and do nothing like that. That's not uncommon. A lot of professional athletes, they don't have as much of that complete day off in the week in the 3 or 4 days before the event. So for them, going for a 30 to 60 minute easy ride or an easy 20, 30, 40 minute run, even in some cases, is going to be relative rest, that you have that big reduction somewhere earlier in that. That's kind of a starting point. So you have that kind of pullback, bit of a reset, rest, and then there's typically some level of building into the event a little bit. That, the typical term people use, you have openers, pre-race openers. The day before often are where somebody's going to be kind of running through the efforts a little bit, pushing somewhat hard because, well, most races aren't, at an easy intensity. I mean, I've never done RAM and I've never coached somebody who's, been successful at RAM.
Have you coached someone who's been unsuccessful at
Actually, I haven't coached anyone unsuccessful
good.
at RAM either. Right. So I'm still out of that element there. Though I did work with some athletes doing some multi-day Paris-Brest-Paris and some of those kind of things. And so we didn't approach the training totally differently that way either. But you do have to have a little bit of a series of efforts to run through the physiological gears as well as test your equipment as well. If you're cycling, you want to make sure everything's working perfectly. And I always like to have some test efforts, not just that day before, but a couple days before in your full race setup. Everything as you're going to be racing it doesn't have to be super long. You don't want to go out and do a, 3-hour TT bike ride in your skin suit and, with your race wheels and your race tires, but You could warm up, go out and do 20 minutes of effort, 30 minutes, and maybe an hour on the full get up and make sure everything works as appropriate. If you need to make adjustments, make sure that you have those couple days to do that. We had a rule with like the hour record, both Rowan and Evie, of 48 hours, nothing will change. No equipment, no anything, no clothing, no helmet, no this, that. We had a company that delivered, we have a new skin suit. Sorry, it arrived 24 hours before the event. It's not going to be used. Like, we have not tested it. We have not vetted it. We don't want to introduce any kind of question mark in that last bit that we don't have to.
This reminds me of a really interesting story. Cameron Dye, somebody I know, Neal, that you know extremely well. There was one day, Cameron, I forget what race it was. It was a big race. A lot of money was on the line, maybe a series lead, something like that. He performed horribly. And just really, really bad. And if you know Cameron, he was an exceptionally strong cyclist. I mean, that is how he crushed people in triathlon. He could not ride his bike. As he said, I was working so hard and going nowhere. I don't know what's wrong with me. Well, a day or two later after this race, I'm sitting in my office at BCSM, and Cameron walked up to me white as a ghost. He said, Can you come down here and look at something with me? And we walked down, and his bike was in the studio. He was going to do some training. And he showed me the chainstay of his bike had been worn all the way through the paint. The tire had not, or the wheel had not been put in straight. He was literally just grinding the tire against the chainstay the whole time.
Yep.
Check your equipment. And honestly, the thing that sticks in my heart right now is just the look on his face.
Yeah.
Like, he couldn't deal with the fact, like, oh my God, it was just this simple. There was nothing wrong with me the whole time.
Yeah.
Checking that equipment is super important. Now, one thing I want to bring up, not to jump topics, Neal, we're talking about checking this equipment. We're talking about getting out on the ride. We're talking about doing these efforts. Are they on the course? Are they not on the course? On the course if possible? On the course for certain events? How do you make that choice?
If possible, on the course. And again, if even more possible, at about the same time that you'll be competing on that course, because conditions vary, whether it's the temperature, whether it's the wind, whether it's those kind of things make a difference. And so in an ideal world, we say you would like to be out there doing some of those efforts at the same time a couple days before, make sure everything is as expected. And if not as expected, you can make those adjustments in those next day or two. And sometimes the adjustment is just your head. Yep. I need to plan for this and expect it's going to be really windy in this section. I might be better off on my base bars through here.
That is a critical part of my prep that I teach my athletes. If it's an A race and I can get out to the event ahead of time, not the day before the event, but 2 days before the event, going out and riding the course, as you said, doing some effort, seeing what a particular hill feels like, that both mentally and physically I find is the best way to get myself ready.
Yeah.
We had a chance to talk with top coach and physiologist Dr. Inigo Samalan about what he does with his athletes leading up to a big event. He told us his plans in terms of exercise, but then took it further into travel and nutrition. Let's hear what he had to say.
Yeah, so that's the whole tapering thing, right? So, I mean, I don't think there's much, in my humble opinion, much of a mystery about the tapering. It's not a science, right? It's just about making sure that you don't overdo it in terms of training the days before, but at the same time, you activate something, right? So I think that at least 4 or 5 days before the race, you want to start entering in that tapering mode to start taking it easy and reducing the amount of hours, intensity, duration, so that you can start assimilating and super compensating all the previous training that you have done the weeks prior. But then you still need to stimulate something. So I like to have like the day before a race, for example, to have some openers, so that you can stimulate, whether it's like a 2 or 3 minute intervals, or maybe like a 10-minute climb that you can do more zone 3, zone 4. But having some openers so that, the body's a little bit used to that, because otherwise, this is trial and error, right? And this is the feedback that I get from many riders, right? That if they don't do anything or any activation the day before, the day of the race, like they feel there's something missing. It's like I know it sounds old school, but it's like, oh, I couldn't open up today, the engine, or the carburetor is not working well, but so yeah, I think it's important to do some openers the day before at least.
Perfect. Outside of training in the last few days, is there anything an athlete can do, say from the massage, nutrition, other factors that aren't the time they're spending on the bike or out running?
Yeah, I think that just, prioritizing recovery and just try to be as least stressed as possible. Travel, it's something that many times you're going to have to do if you want to, if you travel for competitions and travel, it can alter, right, your routine because we think that, I'm taking a day off because I'm traveling. So it's a day off, but actually traveling is not necessarily a day off, right? And you have to get to the airport earlier. The flight might not be comfortable. The food, that day might be disrupting your diet. So I think it's really important to pay attention to the days you travel. Make sure you hydrate well, you eat well, you try to stay as steady as possible. Try to choose other also flights that are not early in the morning or late in the evening. Something that's happening in the middle of the day, if possible. Because again, sometimes you have an early flight and you say, "Oh, great! I'm going to get an early flight to whatever Tucson, Arizona tomorrow." So I can be there by 11 and be at the hotel. Yeah, but that means that you're going to have to get up at 4:30 or 5 to be at the airport at 7 and get to the flight at 9, right? So that's going to be could be a wreck, in the days before competition. And whereas you can maybe sleep in that day if you can and take a noon flight, right? And get there early evening or so, or even go on a bike ride in the morning, and then flight afterwards. But I think the planning of traveling it's very, very important if you have to travel. And then in terms of nutrition, it's just like, don't overdo it. We've been thinking also about, now I have to carbo load and really eat a lot of carbohydrates. Well, if you have already been having a proper nutrition and a proper training and recovery, those days that you're going to be tapering, you're not going to be using much glycogen or carbohydrates. So don't overdo it, right? So you don't need to eat much. Like normally in the full high intensity week, you might be, it depends on your level, right? But let's say 6 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. In that tapering week, you might need maybe 4 to 6. Right. So it's important. Don't overdo it in terms of nutrition those days.
Hi, I'm John Tarkington, the new Director of Coaching, Development, and Education for USA Cycling. We invite all Fast Talk listeners and coaches to join our next USA Cycling Coach Summit on May 6th. It's free. You'll get to know me, and we'll hear from Coach Mike Ricci, founder of D3 Multisport, whose keynote presentation will reveal some of the efficiencies that can drive profitability for any coaching business. Learn more and register now at fasttalklabs.com.
Oftentimes, as racers, we're afraid to not perform at our best for every single race. But with race prioritization, maybe there are A-level things that you want to perform for, but maybe there are B and C-level things that you're either training through or that you can use for experiment. And when you're mapping out that season, it's really important that we are identifying the ones where we can try something new. And experimentation is okay because ultimately that could make you better for your A races.
That's the repetition. You have to practice something enough. You have to trial it enough time to see this seems to be working well. You can make it. Those tweaks and adjustments, adaptations are 2012 women's team pursuit squad that I did a lot of work with. So I was in a consultant role with them as, coach. We had Ben Sharp as the head coach. After the World Championships in 2012, the team actually had a very bad result in Melbourne at the World Championships, like way down. And I was like, well, relative to our goals, like we're off the mark and something has to change. All of our lead up, 2010, 2011, 2012 World Champs and all the other World Cups were literally a 1 week camp before those big events. And so we could do similar things just in that last week. But as you know, in training, it's not just that final week that matters. It's all the other, more important, those, 2 through 6 weeks leading up to it, what was and wasn't done. And we weren't sure because everyone was coming from a different place. And it was like, okay, well, for us to have success in London at the Olympics in August, we're going to have our athletes training together for a longer period of time. And so, we had Jim Miller support that. And so they went to Mallorca to be able to train basically all of June, all of July before we flew to London. And in doing that, I also said, we're going to need to run through the Olympic program because it was different than all the other world championships or World Cups because it was qualifying round 1, round 2, qualifying on one day, and then round 1 and 2 occurring on the same day with just a small window of time in between. And so we started doing a little bit in the last World Cups of doing a second ride on a trainer after they had done the finals, because all the World Cups, it was, qualifying on day 1 and then finals day 2, not a third ride. So we instituted a kind of mock third ride just to get them mentally ready for it. It didn't pan out at Worlds, but then we had more of fully tapering and practicing in June. And then in July, and then, of course, at the Olympics, the entire 3 rides with a qualifying, a round 1 and a round 2. And it was going through that, iterating, making some adjustments in the days based on how they were feeling, because it was also a team environment. It wasn't just one person trying to go well. It was getting, 3 of those riders, or 4 basically, as part of the team to be ready for it.
So you brought up the question of openers. And I'm interested in what your thoughts are on what are good or bad openers. And this was said to me, and I found this really interesting. I've been actually experimenting with this, where somebody told me you should never do threshold work as your openers because that depletes glycogen. And you don't want to be depleting your glycogen the night before a race. So openers should all be short. They should be sprint efforts, something that's more anaerobic and is going to spare your glycogen, but still give your muscles enough of a hit. What's your thought on that?
I mean, my thought on that is actually sprints are actually exclusively glycogen utilizing. And so, I mean, if it's anything more than like the first 6 or 10 seconds. So from that perspective, I don't agree, but I definitely like to see folks do a little bit of below threshold and build up through threshold and have a little bit of typically a build in that, like, feel like you have that control. They're typically 1 to 2 minutes long, somewhere between 4 and 8 of them. The way I often prescribe these is I want you to do enough of these builds so you feel reasonably good relative to the effort. It doesn't mean you feel great doing them, but it's like the effort, my perceived effort relative to the output are kind of in line. And if you get to 6, say, is usually I usually say like 2 to 6 of these. If you've done 6 and you're not feeling that, you're done. It doesn't matter. It's okay to not feel good. And that's just how it is. And that's part of the mental of expectation, not setting an expectation of you should feel like a hero. Everything should be awesome. Because if you're like, that song, everything is awesome. If you think everything is going to be awesome all the time, you're going to be set up for a lot of disappointment. In most cases, you don't feel awesome all the time. And in racing, some of the best results occur from actually you get out there and I feel like garbage at the start and you just
turn around,
save energy. Save energy, and all of a sudden you're making selections, and it's like, whoa, now I'm competitive because I didn't blow all the energy because I didn't feel so good at the beginning.
Yeah, all of my best efforts have come when I felt like garbage, either in the warm-up or the days prior to a race. Every single one of them.
It's wild how that can happen, and it's happened at the highest levels, I can tell you.
I actually get scared when I start a race and I'm feeling no pain because that tells me a whole lot of painkillers are flowing. And the reason they're flowing is because there's a lot of muscle damage there, and I'm going to pay for this. And almost invariably, halfway through the race, you just start falling apart.
Halfway through the race, Trevor is punching his quads, trying to like,
come on,
do something.
So
go to work, do your job.
So let's jump to the warm up. And I know this is a big question because there's a lot of different types of events. Mm-hmm. Warming up for a short track event versus a 5-hour road race are entirely different things. But are there any general principles here? Yeah. In terms of your warm up?
Fatigue level going into your event is going to impact potentially how long you need to warm up to feel reasonably ready or to be able to perform at your best. So individuals, when they're in like a stage race, and if it's day 4 out of a 5-day stage race, you probably need more of a warm up, not less. Huh. It seems like I'm tired. I just can't do much. I'm going to conserve all my energy. And I forget there is a pro cyclist who just doesn't warm up ever in Grand Tours. And that's kind of wild. There aren't many people who do that. Most riders feel better with a longer warm up when they have more fatigue. And the same thing goes if you were training through an event and you didn't taper down, that you might need just a little more time to feel good. It's kind of like in training. If you go out and you're in your third week of a block and you're doing some efforts, and you might not feel great the first 30 minutes, but 90 minutes into it, like things start clicking a little bit. And it's the same kind of idea that you need a little longer warm up when you're carrying more fatigue to be ready then to start.
I think that's interesting. I don't have any experience coaching at the Grand Tour level. My assumption as a lay person is that we have a long race, we have a neutral rollout. Some people are a little spicy off the start, but not everybody. It seems like warm-up would just sort of be built into the opening Ks of the stage.
Yeah, so I have, specifically a fresh warm-up. When you've rested, you're tapered, you just need 25 minutes and basically a little bit of a tempo effort, a few ramps up to over threshold, and then unleash the fury. Like everything's ready to go, primed. We've done everything right in the leading days, rested, go. I have a Grand Tour warm-up where that one is almost 45 minutes long on the trainer. And it includes a much longer tempo. It has a build and then a series of, just below, just above, and right at threshold efforts, because you need more to get going with that fatigue. And that's been honed over many, many years with multiple athletes. And the same thing when they just do that 25 or 30 minute warm up in a Grand Tour for a TT.
It's not enough.
It's not enough. Like I felt good the second half, but I was just absolutely unable to do anything in the first half, and they feel good later. It's like, okay, we need to do more in that. And in most cases in Grand Tours too, they also do ride at least some part of the course or some kind of ride in the morning, because the races for them are happening in the afternoon. And so they go out for an hour and a half in the morning, and then they're doing that 45-minute warm-up. They're doing the race, and then they're doing a proper cool-down, because usually there's some other hellacious mountain stage coming after that. And that's just how it is. Like rest happens in a Grand Tour when it's over, not during it, relatively speaking.
Well, the race that really clued me in on this was Tour of the Gila, which is a 5-day race where basically the first 4 days, they're just trying to wear one another down. And then the entire race happens on the last day.
Boom.
And what you see is the first day, guys might spin around a little bit in the parking lot to get ready. It's like 5-10 minutes of a very slow warm-up. That final day, and the first time I ever saw this, I was like, what are they doing? But
Ride
fully
from
get
town.
it now. It's 40 minutes to the start.
Yep.
And the big teams will all ride to the start line.
Exactly.
And it's exactly what you're talking about. It's turning those legs around because they know off the gun, this is going to be a brutal
race. If they
race.
haven't done enough warm-up, it's going to be very, very uncomfortable for longer.
Now, do you guys take that thinking to, say, a cyclocross race or a crit, something that's a little bit harder from the start, as opposed to, bringing this to the more normal listener, as opposed to a road race? Are there different warm-up strategies for sort of different events and their requirements?
Yeah, so conditions, the ambient conditions where the warm-up occurs and how that occurs is also going to have an impact. So if it is really warm conditions, so I've got an athlete at Paranationals right now in Huntsville, Alabama, and it was like, okay, like the weather is a factor. So what's the weather forecast looking like relative to your start time? Because that's going to impact which warm-up we're going to go for. It's actually going to be in the 30s overnight low going into the TT, which is on Saturday. And so we're going to do the longer warm-up because it's not going to be extreme heat. Whereas a lot of times we've been in say, Tennessee for nationals, and it's like midday. It's like, okay, we're doing literally a 15 or 20-minute warm-up. It's going to be, 10 minutes easy, 3 1-minute efforts, on, off. That's it. We don't want to elevate your core temperature. Even in doing so, it's like, try to be in the shade, have a ice vest, all of those things to prevent any core temperature rise. Whereas if it's 30 degrees in the morning, it's going to take more time to get core temperature up, muscle temperature up, being ready to go.
And this is one of those things I think maybe we can bring a little bit of science into. There's almost this pulling of we want muscle temperature almost as high as we can get it, but we want core temperature as low as we can get it. How do you sort of deal with both of those is different. And what I think is interesting is in the science, when you look at like a passive warming up, there are things like heated pants, right? Can really have a lot of these sort of warm-up induced improvements in performance, and so it is interesting on a warm day. wearing some tights or something like that, you're already getting that passive warm up, that passive muscle temperature increase that gets you a good way, toward all the warm up improvements that you can get. Now, active warm up certainly has some additional, benefit on top of that, but definitely taking the ambient temperature and conditions in is hugely important in making sure this is proper.
Exactly. Another part then is what the demand is going to be for the event right off the go.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Track cycling, we have standing starts in many of our events, timed events and things like that. And so we had to do some additional things for that kind of torque, for that force production to be prepared for that. So we did actually use a vibration platform and being able to do some activation exercises with basically doing partial squats with that just for a little bit of a stimulus. But the other thing that we did that was more important, because in most cases, track cyclists are warming up on pretty much stationary rollers, don't have a huge amount of resistance with those. And so we would actually have the athletes on a concrete place away from the rest of everyone else, usually a hallway underneath the velodrome, have them on their bike. We would hold it and they would be doing a simulated 4 to 6 pedal stroke maximal push as we're holding and resisting them moving forward to get that torque being applied, get that actual neuromuscular force production that just is in no way possible on rollers. And then we had no other way of doing that. We weren't going to load up a bunch of barbells and carry them around or fly around the world with all that, with the weight equipment. And so that was a way we could mimic that. And the best way to do that is actually a little ramp uphill, which a lot of times at a velodrome, you have those, a little bit of a concrete ramp here and there and just a few pedal strokes. So cyclocross probably would be a place where you would find value in doing some of that torque part of the last bit of your warm-up, doing a couple torque efforts to mimic that start just to be ready for that activation.
Same thing coming out of a TT start gate, so.
That was always part of my time trial or crit warm-up was some big gear sprints.
Yep.
Get that maximal neural activation. And spot on, there's a bunch of research in the last 5-6 years on warm-up showing that really the two gains that you're getting from a warm-up are raising the muscle temperatures you brought up and getting that neural activation. But the interesting thing is most of these studies show the warm-up effect really only benefits you for about 2-3 minutes. And then your body's going to end up being in the same place. So in a track event that's 6 minutes or a 10-minute time trial, that's the difference between winning and losing.
Yeah.
Or a cross race where you have to get your position right off the gun. That's really critical. In a 5-hour road race, unless they're killing it off the gun, it's actually not going to make that big a difference.
Yep.
And the interesting thing I found in these studies is they said one of the biggest mistakes they were seeing in athletes is doing too much of a warm-up and actually going into the race a little fatigued.
Yeah, it is possible to definitely overcook it. So in a stage race, looking at the profile, and that's another thing, when you look at week 3 and it's a 10K uphill off the start.
Off the gun. Yep.
Oh my gosh. If you have an athlete who, they're a GC rider, they need to warm up because they don't want to get dropped. I mean, I think somebody earlier this year at a big race, popped off early in a stage and lost the race. Race leader got dropped in the first climb and everything just went to, it blew apart. Totally different race winner 2 days later. That happened. So you have to look ahead at both what the opportunities are if you're somebody who, isn't where you would think you should be and you want to make an advancement, or if you want to maintain where you're at, you got to be ready for that start. Or if you're trying to go in a breakaway on a day like that, man, you literally are going to do a full TT warm up and be ready to rock it right from the go.
And I think that if we take this a little bit broader to say running, right? A lot of people are out there, they're running 5Ks, they're running 10Ks. And I think that those athletes are more in this domain of going hard off the start. It's not like cycling where you can roll out, you're sitting in the group, you're drafting. Exactly. And so warm up might be a little bit more important to get out and do those strides and everything before your running race. And, it's funny, Neal, you're talking about, in the hallway below the velodrome, which basically describes my entire, life as a track and field athlete. And I have fond memories of running at the Armory in New York City, which, if anybody knows, is on the second or the third floor of this New York City block building. And everybody warms up in the hallway, on the first floor. So you're running down this polished, surface, and then you pop upstairs and you're out on the track in this big thing. And it's such this amazing experience. But the other thing that happens a lot in track and field, and that happened to me, was at big races like Penn Relays, UPenn. It's such a well-run event with so many people. It is so scripted. You warm up. It feels like an hour before you actually get on the track. And then you spend an hour. You're in one corral. You move to the next corral. You turn to the right. You step over a line. You turn to the left. You step over a line. You follow a guy with a flag. You stand on the side of the field. It's amazing how scripted it is. But as an athlete, I would never expect to have good performances there because I was done. I was hungry by the time I was getting out there running.
Yep. One last thing I'll throw in about the warm-up. Neal, I might get a good laugh out of you from this. I think one of the most important parts of your warm-up is scoping the parking lot, which is you bike around. So I'm talking mostly cycling here. You see what all the big teams are doing. And if they are sitting in lounge chairs,
then you should be
chatting away, it's like, not going to worry about this. If all the domestiques for the big teams are on trainers with a look of death on their
get
faces,
ready to go.
It's going to be hard off the gun, and you better be ready.
Yep, definitely. Knowing what's going on, and people will give clues like that.
Yep.
I can tell you from triathlon, my thing about a running warm-up there was literally going to the farthest away porta potty because there's going to be no line. That was like a tactical advantage. I didn't have to wait. I didn't have to worry about anyone knowing where there's one. It's literally a half mile over there at the Boulder Reservoir over by, off the side. You're not going to have to stand in the 15-minute line and be waiting. Way better. It's tactics, baby.
Speaking about that thing, that can undo your race, right? Knowing where the prime porta potty is can really be a big advantage.
Absolutely. You got to plan. You got to plan for these things.
Yeah, I'm not going to share some stories, but
there are plenty. That's a whole other episode.
That is a different episode that we would never publish.
but maybe a good transition to the nutrition that you can do before the race.
Bingo.
Good transition, Rob. I like it.
Trevor is so happy with me right now.
Let's dive into nutrition. So 4 days out, what does nutrition look like?
Yeah, in most cases at that 4 days out, people are reducing their overall training load. And so actual total intake may be coming down a little bit. You're not going into starvation mode. You're not doing anything ridiculous or silly in that way, but there's potentially a little bit of an absolute reduction in total calories. Though at that point, I am still a proponent of having a slightly higher than typical carbohydrate intake. There was the old school stuff, and I did this before my first Ironman of a glycogen depleting workout a week out, and then you would just super compensate.
Yep.
I think all the studies that we've seen since those early days in the 80s and 90s is that literally if you just bump up your intake for 3 to 5 days before an event, having 20 or 30% more carbohydrate than normal, you're going to get fully replete stores unless you're coming in at some extremely low level to begin with, or your daily intake is just too low anyhow.
Really important thing to understand with that, though, is if you are trying to build your glycogen stores, glycogen is basically a mole of glucose bound to 4 moles of water. In other words, if you are building your glycogen stores, you're going to put on a lot of weight. So people will do this, step on the scale every day and go, oh my God, I just put on 3-4 pounds. I'm going to lose the race. It's water.
Yep. Rowan going into the hour, it was like, oh my gosh, he's gained, 2 kilos since he got here. I'm like, perfect. Everything's on target. Because the typical European pro, like going into a race, you don't want to gain weight. I was like, there's no hills on the track. Well, unless you go up the banking, which in the hour record, he really didn't. He stayed pretty much on the black line. So literally 2 kilos is going to cost less than like a watt on the flat.
Yep.
But having that glycogen is going to be absolutely necessary when pushing over 400 watts for an hour, because glycogen is going to limit performance more than that. Bit of water weight predominantly. Again, that, those glycogen stores being topped off, great. Carrying water, which, great. And guess what? In the hour, you also don't get to drink anything. So having some additional fluid on board with that glycogen, man, that's like the perfect situation. I was happy. The others were kind of funny about it. So if you are an athlete and you weigh yourself frequently, and if you see yourself gaining a couple pounds, 2, 3, 4 pounds before an event, you're doing it right. It probably in terms of your fueling.
Yep.
I think that bringing up the hour record is really interesting because I spent a lot of time looking through some research prior to this on the whole glycogen loading thing. And what I saw, there wasn't necessarily a consensus as to whether or not carbohydrate loading was going to be effective for you or not. And great study from Dr. Burke and Dr. Hawley, Dr. Noakes, all of them who are like, carbohydrate loading failed to improve 100-kilometer cycling performance, right? And some of the takeaways from this is if you're going to be able to feed and eat during an event, then having proper glycogen prior to the event is kind of all that you need. But I think that there are special cases like the hour record. As you said, you can't eat, you can't drink. Even in mountain biking, maybe where you're able to carry a water bottle, how much are you actually getting in? So mountain biking, cyclocross, hour record, TT, all of those things, you don't want to break the aero position. Maybe that is an area where making sure that your carbohydrate is as good as it can be. Maybe you don't need to do anything crazy, but those are events that are very high power output. For a 45 minutes to an hour, these are the things that can deplete your glycogen. Being topped off is probably a good thing, but at the same time, if you're able to ride longer a couple hours, eat a whole bunch, maybe being fully topped off isn't necessary or it doesn't have a huge effect on performance. Yeah. Trevor, your thoughts on that? You're the long race guy, I feel like. Well,
so there are actually studies showing that if you supercompensate your glycogen, so build the levels higher than normal, when you are in a race situation, your body's actually going to rely on glucose more for fuel.
It oxidizes it.
And over a long event, you can actually, even though you go in with more glycogen, you can actually deplete it more quickly. So I agree. If you're doing those long events, I actually don't think trying to maximize, like you want to make sure you're at 100% with your glycogen, but trying to get to that 130%, might not be the best strategy. But I do also agree that that shorter event, that 1 hour event, where you are going to be going at intensity where you're naturally going to be relying mostly on glucose for fuel, absolutely. You want to have as much as possible.
I'd say you're right on target. The one thing to keep in mind in a multi-day, if you actually completely deplete your stores on any day, if you have the dreaded, the British don't like that word, but if you get glycogen
what
depleted,
word don't the British like?
Bonk.
Really? That's a bad.
That means something else.
I've never been to.
My apologies to all our British listeners who've been using that word a lot.
They probably snicker every time they hear an American use that. So we'll just say.
But they're okay with the word fanny, or no? Fanny is bad. Fanny is bad too.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm on.
It's a bum bag if you're Aussie and.
There's nothing good about a fanny pack. I don't care what you call it. There is nothing good about it.
You offended every gravel cyclist and mountain biker in the world.
It's a bum bag. So in Aussie speak, at least. But if you do,
hold on, wait. It's a bum bag. I can't get over this. I'm sorry.
If you deplete your glycogen, it cannot be fully replenished in 24 hours. If you absolutely zero out, you are in trouble for days.
Try as you may.
And so it's so important. And that's the thing, in a Grand Tour, if somebody bottoms out, usually they're in doo-doo for not just that day, but in the coming days, there's going to be a reckoning because you just can't get it all back in no matter what you do. It takes several days of a little bit of overfeeding to get back to fully replete.
Which is why especially when you're in that stage race, fueling during the event.
Yeah. And so often
critical.
You'll see guys taking bottles in the last, 15 minutes, and it's not for that moment, even though, there's the carbohydrate mouth rinse, all that kind of stuff. It's literally they're starting their recovery, making sure that they're not bottomed out, making sure they don't get down to that bankrupt and zeroed out.
I think for a long time, people didn't realize how much cyclists were actually eating, in these races. I think maybe recently it's become a little bit more to light, but oftentimes I love doing longer races. I'm not really cut out for it, but for me, it's oftentimes an eating competition more than a riding competition, tell you the truth. So,
yeah. I remember working with an Ironman athlete who was a bigger guy, in the, close to 180 pounds, 170 some. And we did testing in the lab where Rob and I worked. I was like, well, you should be taking in about 120 to 150 grams of carbohydrate an hour. He's like, are you kidding me?
Which is a huge number.
And it's like, well, nobody can do that. And it's like, well, the research I'm pretty sure is a little bit behind. Like we've seen people who've been doing this, and that guy won a big race. He was top 10 at Ironman Hawaii. It's like intake relative to the expenditure with that capacity. It's just, you have to train your stomach. And again, you can't eat certain types of carbohydrate to get it all. It has to be from a mix. So mixed carbohydrate source is part of that, but it worked. And again, big guy, he can hold 350 watts for, many hours. And so you just have to scale things.
Often digestive issues drive an athlete's nutrition strategy more than performance in the 24 hours leading up to an event. Let's hear from digestion expert Patrick Wilson on things we can do to make sure our guts function at their best in the event. Are there things that you can do in those days leading up to make sure that your gut is going to work with you and not against you as you're getting ready for a race?
Yeah, I mean, you could take a look at a couple of those dietary approaches. I mean, the few days beforehand, you got to remember stuff is moving through your gut. It takes anywhere from a day for some people, upwards of 5 days for others. I mean, the whole transit of the gut in terms of once you ingest it and the residue ends up at the other end, that's kind of the time frame you're looking at. So that's generally the window before an event where you can have some impact on some of those things nutritionally. So that could include, reducing fiber intake if you're worried about kind of having to use, the restroom too many times. Fiber intake is directly correlated with stool amount and weight on a given day. So I mean, that's obviously one thing you can take a look at is tapering your fiber intake if you're a little bit worried about that. I even saw recently on Twitter a scientist publishing something about tapering fiber intake and its impact on cycling weight. And the study's not out yet, but they were kind of indicating that there were some interesting findings there. So, we'll see what happens with that. The FODMAP thing would be another one, potentially targeting FODMAPs for a day or two beforehand if you are especially experiencing like bloating and cramping, loose stools, that sort of thing. That could be a potential strategy there. Avoiding way too much of NSAIDs. I mean, obviously, endurance athletes have a lot of lingering injuries in some cases or just nagging pains. And if they're anticipating they're going to have an exacerbation of those injuries during their event, they might try and proactively take a lot of NSAIDs. And that is certainly a recipe for gut problems if you take it in a high enough dose. So I think that would be something to be aware of and careful about. And if you can find ways to get through the race without using them, that would be, generally my recommendation. And the other thing is, if you're the anxious type of person that gets really worked up before races, try and figure out a way to center yourself a little bit better and maybe implement some strategies to dampen that stress response, whether it be slow, deep breathing, listening to relaxing music, practicing some mindfulness strategies. I think the combination of those things could be, a strategy to at least reduce the severity of the symptoms that someone might experience or the likelihood. Depends on, again, what their underlying causes are for their problems. But those are at least, 3 or 4 things that I think practically athletes could take away and maybe utilize in that pre-event period.
We're about halfway through this episode with Neal Henderson on race week preparation. When it's all over, don't stop learning. Head over to fasttalklabs.com, where we have articles and more Fast Talk episodes on pre-race warm-ups, what to pack for mountain bike races, how to prepare for events at altitude, and more. See more on race preparation at fasttalklabs.com. So let's dive a little more specifically into nutrition strategies for the day before and the morning of, because this is one of the places where you can see a lot of athletes absolutely destroy the race.
Yep. So again, you're not going to try to institute any new foods that you haven't done. So this is a pattern that you should have been practiced multiple times and know what is available. And if it's not available where you're at, you had to bring it. So again, people traveling internationally at times like, oh my gosh, they don't have X, Y, or Z available. I did a race in the Caribbean once, and our pre-race meal was basically KFC. Not recommended. I did not perform very well off of fried chicken and corn. Like, I did not have adequate carbohydrates. That was a hard lesson to learn. So if rice is the only thing you eat, great. If you're racing in Asia, going to be super easy. If you're in Norway, might not be as easy. Make sure that you either know what you are used to is available, or you bring your own. I would always say bring some of your own anyhow, because even if it's supposedly normally available, if whatever kitchen in your hotel doesn't open up until 6 a.m. and you got to leave at 5, you have to be prepared. So low residue is something that people have been doing a little bit more of, and that's having less fiber.
Yep.
Going to more simpler carbohydrate to reduce some of the GI side of things. So white rice better than brown rice, and that white bread better than brown bread or wheat bread. Some of those type in terms of low residue idea.
Just keep in mind, low residue diet can help your performance, prevent GI issues during the race.
But it's not your
It's
week in
not
and
a
week out.
healthy diet.
Correct. This is not something that you should be doing 365 days a year. This should be for your big events for just a couple days, and that's for your performance. And then you go back to a better, healthier diet for sure.
And that should be eating in general, right? Like eating you're doing should be up for a purpose. You're making choices with the food that you're eating. And sometimes that choice is just, I need low GI distress so I can perform tomorrow. And then your choice later is healthy lifestyle, reduction of disease risk, so on and so forth.
So what about the morning of?
Yep. Morning of timing is important relative to the intensity. And there are some folks out there with cast iron stomachs that an hour and a half beforehand can eat some solid food and be good to go. I would not recommend that. I typically say the higher the intensity, the longer out you want to go from some sort of meal with solids. So at least 2, typically 3 hours is a safer place. And those solids are typically, again, going to be fairly simple. A plain, a bagel with some sort of jam or fruit, a banana and a plain bagel. Pretty easy on the stomach for most folks, but practice this. So again, oatmeal for a lot of folks is one of those things, but you can't just do it, 2 hours before and have no problem in most cases.
And that's where practicing that is really important, right? We know a lot of things you shouldn't leave to a race day decision, but you should know ahead of time based on workouts, based on your sequencing, based on other races, what's going to work for you. And my favorite story here, and I might have shared this before, is I had an athlete. I coached a UCI level junior cyclocross team, and we were flying to a race. This athlete knew exactly what worked for him as a pre-race meal, and so he took it with him in his carry-on. And so when we went through security, even though it was hilarious, they couldn't not let it through because it was all canned, like prepackaged things or whatever. But we're standing there and we're watching the conveyor belt of the X-ray machine. Here comes a can of corn. And then like 2 feet later, a bag of rice. And it took like minutes for everything to come through. I was dying laughing.
My worst ever in that scenario was I went down to the Caribbean to do a race, and I was team manager for our team. And we were in a place where there's no bike shops. You got to bring whatever you need. And I had to figure out the whole weight thing. So I knew the heaviest stuff I was going to put in my shoulder bag. And I was bringing down the Gatorade for the team. So I didn't even think about this, but I bought like 20 of those little tubs of Gatorade. I'm like, well, I can't fit all these tubs into a shoulder bag. So I got big plastic bags, dumped all this Gatorade into these plastic bags. I get down there and I go through the security and they see giant bags of white powder
wrapped in duct tape for some reason.
And they pull it out and they're like, what is this? And I'm like, honestly, it's Gatorade. I swear to you.
It's drink mix, man.
Yeah, you're like, well, that's lemon lime and that's fruit punch.
Different flavors. Important stuff. Yeah. I think one of the easiest pre-race or easiest on the stomach for a lot of folks, rice, scrambled egg, little olive oil, little salt. You can put a little bit of Parmesan cheese or something like that if you want a little bit of flavor, but that's pretty much a super simple go-to for that works well. I can't tell you how many athletes over time that I know that they go to a rice-based pre-race meal as their simplest, easy, can get it, can do it almost anywhere without too much difficulty.
But I am going to point out these things are trainable. So if you are somebody who has that issue of if you eat within 3 hours of the race, it affects your race, don't train it during your races, but Saturday morning group ride before a workout. Start practicing eating really close, and it's going to be a little uncomfortable at first, but you can train it. You can make it better.
Yeah. The other side of this, too, is that your body can change. I know for a long time I was an iron stomach type of person, and a couple of years ago, that changed for me. And I was having a lot of GI distress, stomach pain in cyclocross races, and it would really limit me from being able to go the workload that I otherwise could have. So if you had something that worked for you in the past and it doesn't work for you anymore, it's time to re-experiment. It's time to re-change.
Adapt and adjust. And one of the big things I would say in all of this is take notes. Now,
Yep.
I'm an analog guy. I still write stuff down, but on a training log, if you have, whatever training software you like to use, when you have your files of workouts that you've done, if you can also add notes in there, that is some of the best places, especially if you can search by word, then you could go back and see what you've done previously. So, way back before we had any of those kind of, software training things that you could save all that stuff and reference it anywhere in the world, which is awesome. Now I can go look back at stuff 20 years old and see what I did because I kept fastidious notes in the electronic format as well. But when I turned pro in 2001, I went through my written training logs of things that I did training wise, as well as looked at, good days and what did I eat. I often had notes when I was very, very early on of what I ate, when I ate that. So I knew okay, repeat this, do not repeat that. This definitely worked, this definitely didn't. And over time, you'll have a better understanding of your own N=1.
Any other thoughts on nutrition strategies?
Always make sure your water source is good. So often,
That's an important
Giardia
one.
will undo your race.
There are so many things.
We're back to the porta potty.
Water quality side that may affect you on the day itself. I did a race once where I filled up from a hose. That didn't end well. I don't know how long that water had been sitting there in and out of sun baking cycles with whatever kind of plastics and rubbers and everything leaching into it, but it ended my day as a performance. I was able to finish that race, but water quality. Make sure you're saying that. And again, when you travel certain places, bottled water only, never eat an ice cube. All those kind of things are real.
Being careful about the water you drink is one thing you can do, but as Coach Renee Eastman discussed with us, the best thing you can do in general is to focus on the things that you can control.
Focus on the things that you can control, going to bed early, taking care of your hydration, taking care of your nutrition. The nutrition, the specifics of it are really, a little bit dependent on what it is. Is it, Leadville mountain bike race is going to be 9 hours long, or is it a criterium where, glycogen depletion is not an issue? I would say don't introduce new things into those last couple days of the nutrition plan of start taking supplements or cut out all your coffee just in the last couple days. Plan ahead. That's one thing to do in those couple days before your race, especially if you're having to travel to your race. Where are you going to eat dinner? When are you going to eat dinner? How are you going to get breakfast before the race? What time are you going to eat breakfast before the race? And in those kinds of things, to maybe pack your own food so it's all taken care of, or know where you can get your favorite thing to eat that night before. It'd probably be good to come up with a checklist. I think I've been doing this so long, I've got my own mental checklist. But the things that I personally do race week, and I encourage my athletes to do race week, are the same things that I encourage them to do week in and week out during their training. That, on race day, it shouldn't be a whole lot different than how you would treat yourself in the day of or the days leading into a really hard training session. You should have already, by the time you get to race day, have had plenty of really hard training sessions that mimic the demands of your race. And, maybe if it's Leadville, you didn't do a whole 100-mile mountain bike ride, but similarly, really exhaustive long rides. So it's just maintaining those good habits. So that idea of a specific thing that you do on race week versus training week, I don't think it should really be a whole lot different, to be honest.
Love hearing you say that. That's a question I give athletes all the time, where they figure out a routine. They have their Saturday morning group ride that they're doing great at, and then they get to a race and go, oh, no, I got to change everything that I do. You just go, why would you take something that works for you, throw that out the window, and do something you never do on an important day?
Right. And then you get to practice on those group ride days of, what works best for you, pancake breakfast or oatmeal, or is it 3 hours before your ride or 2 hours or whatnot?
So at the time we have left, there's two areas that we still need to address. One is sleep and rest, and the other one is travel, if travel is part of getting to your event. So what are your thoughts on sleep and getting rest?
Yeah, so sleep is a secret weapon for athletes. Have it, and if you sleep well, you are much, much better odds of being able to perform to your best than if you're not sleeping well. So being able to sleep well is kind of a weapon. There's also some evidence that shows that actually if you have increased sleep in the days leading into a performance relative to normal, you actually perform even better than if you maintained your normal sleep cycle. And the exact opposite of that, if you reduce sleep over several days leading into it, you're going to have even more further reduced performance.
It's interesting because that's it's a little contrary, Neal, to what I've experienced, tell you the truth. I do think with the research I looked at, essentially, and I think that anecdotally, if you talk to people, insomnia, difficulty sleeping before a race, the struggle's real. I think that happens to a lot of people. That maybe that's something that you can't necessarily control because of anxiety and nerves. You have to control those things, and then maybe that helps your insomnia. The other thing that I found really interesting, though, in a review study was that sleep hygiene tended to get worse. The anxiety that people had caused them to make poor decisions. They spent a lot of time on their electronics before bed to kind of fill that time, which makes it harder to sleep. Yeah. Or they're doing other things, traveling in a hotel. So I think that sometimes there isn't a choice, but sometimes there is. And the factors that you can control are really important for you to create a good environment for sleep, to make those strong choices, to maximize whatever potential you're going to have.
Yep. But look, this is an important one. And, I was somebody early in my cycling career, the night before key events, I wouldn't be able to sleep at all. I can't tell you how many races that were important to me I did on zero sleep the night before because of stress and anxiety. And I did get over that, but it was an issue. And it was helpful for me to see research showing that one bad night of sleep has pretty minimal impact on your performance. I think what has a bigger impact on performance is going to the race. It's an important race, and you just had a sleepless night, and you're nervous about what that does to you. So what I have learned, or what I learned was, when I have those nights, don't lie in bed stressing about, oh no, my race is now ruined. Get out of bed, go read a book, and just say, I'm not going to get a night of sleep, but it's actually not going to affect my performance that much. Read a book, watch a movie, and just remind yourself this isn't as devastating as I think it's going to be.
And as a coach, I think that you can downplay, the effect that it might have on the athlete. My one athlete that I coach always, maybe has some trouble sleeping. And I always, no matter what, I'm insistent that I had my best races after my worst night of sleep. Whether or not it's true doesn't matter. But as you're saying, it's the psychology side of this that can have a hugely detrimental effect. So really being able to support your athlete in their confidence is going to have a big improvement.
Definitely. And that's the biggest thing, that confidence comes back to that. And so not panicking as an athlete, if you're disrupted, if it's less than ideal, okay, manage the stress. And that's that, like reading a book at that point, if you're awake, okay, that's going to help kind of reset you and not just send you in that cycle of continuing to escalate and elevate that stress response, that anxiety.
Exactly.
Managing that in the coach, the same thing, okay, you didn't sleep as well. There is research that will say like the night before is not that important, right? From some of the different Army studies and things like that. I don't know how many times I've had to say that, like night before really doesn't matter at all.
But the thing that will kill you is lying in bed for 8 hours stressing.
Correct.
That will impact you.
The anxiety associated with that, because that's, all the cortisol disturbance, everything there.
So let's move over to travel, which I know you have dealt with a lot yourself and with your athletes. So you can talk about the perfect 4 days preps for an event, but often you're on a plane or, from my experience, you're driving for 22 hours.
Yep. In a van with stinky other people.
Yep.
Yeah. I could deal with all of it except for being in a van with 8 22-year-olds.
Anymore. You gave that up.
Yeah. No, I can't. I just can't do that anymore. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So having, again, a plan with your travel, looking ahead and what are your connections. And in a lot of cases, people book poor travel because it's cheaper.
Yeah, to save $30.
Is that $100 difference worth 3 layovers and a potential for your equipment to get wrecked and more time to lose a flight and to get there later or miss your race, all those things. Always look a little bit from the practical point of view. A nonstop flight is better than having a stop, especially in the transcontinental ones. For myself, going back and forth to Europe for a period of time, I was doing that, I don't know how many times a year, too many. And it was like, I need to do the Denver to Frankfurt or Denver to London. I have to do that as my first leg. That way I can get some sleep. I usually do an afternoon flight, so it is a potential for me to be able to get sleep. Land there in the morning. I'm closer to the cycle because there's daylight when I land. I may travel a little bit more, maybe a little more difficult to stay awake, but managing some of the things with jet lag is about the schedule and scheduling, putting yourself on flights that are going to fit that schedule pretty well. Other couple key things to keep in mind: hydration when you're on a plane. It's a fairly dry environment. Those of us who live in Boulder, we're kind of used to dry. But if you are, from a humid area, you get on a plane, it's very dry air and is actually only pressurized to, if you're on a new 787, I think they get it down to about 4,000 feet of elevation, effective feel. If you're on some of the older planes, it's more like 6,000, 7,000 feet of elevation of impact while you're in that plane. So if you're on a long flight from here to Australia, 10 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours, that's a stressor if you're not already coming from altitude and if you're not hydrating. So you have to stay hydrated, so avoid alcohol. I'm not a big fan of any of the sleep aids and the sleep drugs and things like that. I'm in any case, and especially with travel, especially if it's not something you do consistently, you're just going to be throwing an element in there that is probably going to cause you some problems. Some of that being your GI with some of those. So plan, take a look, sleep when you can on that flight as best you can. So bring whatever you need, a pillow, an inflatable thing, an eye mask, noise canceling headphones and or ear pods, whatever you do in that way. All of those things will help you.
Other thing I'm going to add is whether it's a flight or you're in the van doing the 20-hour drive, good food is not going to generally be available to you. And this was particularly an issue on the van where we would stop at gas stations, and gas station food is horrible. Pack some food.
Yep. Bring what you want there. Compression gear, compression socks, definitely good on those long flights or long drives, especially. Those things will definitely help. I've never been able to bring on like a Normatex or anything like that on a plane, but in a car.
I would love to see that on a plane.
The new thing. So this year this last year I did the Leadville. So Leadville on Saturday, and then had to go from Leadville to Steamboat and do Steamboat Gravel, 144 miles on Sunday. My wife was an angel. She drove from Leadville to Steamboat. I was able to sit in the back seat with the Normatec boots on for like an hour.
I love it.
And using the Theragun to be able to just massage and spend some of that time in the car, actually helping to accelerate that recovery process. That's not your standard, but if you can plan ahead, and be ready to be able to do some of those things, it'll just make it a little bit better.
And I would say once you're off the plane or you've arrived, doing those Normatex is great. I'm actually, interested in your opinion on this, I'm a big fan of get on the bike and do a little neuro work. Do some high cadence sprints, get that blood flowing in the legs again.
Yeah. On that day of landing. So normally I try to do the overnight flight. You land sometime in the day. It's usually, sometimes afternoon till you're at where you're going. Put your bike together because you need to know if there's a problem. If you wait to the next day, you've lost again so many hours of time of being able to troubleshoot, come up with an alternative. So ASAP is unpack your bike. Also reporting if there are any damages that you can report that. If you wait too long, you actually miss out on some of that window. So get that bike together, get out and ride, extend that first day and try to stay awake. Don't try to go to bed at 2 p.m. and try to sleep to the next day. That's trouble. You're going to never get your clock reset if you really don't try to work on it.
You have to have the one miserable day.
Yep.
And then
take
you
that one
quicker.
longer day and then get into the rhythm and wake up in the morning, get into the sunshine, actual sunshine. And I know when you travel over to Europe in the winter, it's a little bit harder because there's a little bit less sun. Taylor used to travel with, one of the happy lights, basically get that extra UV exposure early to try to get that body clock reset. He never did really well with international travel. These big time zone delays. It took him a week at least going from here to Europe to feel reasonably good. Some folks can do it in 3 or 4 days, but by and large, a day per hour on a time zone change is a good rule of thumb.
What about on the domestic side of things? You're traveling to another state, maybe you're traveling across the country. How early are you planning on going out to maximize your performance? You can go too early.
Yeah. Yep. So the ambient conditions, if you're traveling to the southeast and it's going to be swampy and you're used to, arid Colorado or Utah, that's a big shift, and you need to have some heat acclimatization in terms of that heat and humidity specifically. The humidity is a big thing. And so even before you leave, potentially doing some overdressing so you actually have a little bit of a humid layer on you while you're doing some of your training in the last week or so would be good, because some of the heat adaptations, 7 to 10 days of exposure will give you, your primary adaptations that are possible. But that humidity aspect is quite different. Somebody who's coming up to altitude from sea level, that's also now there's ideal situation, 7 to 10 days, but realistically then maybe better just 1 or 2 days. In that 3 or 4 days, in most cases, your body is trying to adapt to that, and you're at the most point of disruption.
About 4 or 5 days after arriving at altitude.
So people coming up to Boulder Ironman, it's either come a week or more or come immediately before.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you always have those, you have to be here to pick up your packet by this time. It's like, okay, so with that in mind, what's the minimum, or what do I need to be for the longer term, that 7 to 10 day? So either basically less than 3 or greater than 7 is kind of the best in those dramatic changes in environment of elevation, heat, and humidity compared to what you'd be used to. Now, going to somewhere colder,
Nah.
You're not going to have you don't really have cold adaptations other than your potential tolerance or how long it takes you to grow a beard if you're a guy to help keep your face from freezing off. That's one of my things that I do, because I'm bald on top here. I got no hair on the top of my head, so getting some facial hair helps in the winter.
I was going to say, my thing in the winter, I let my hair grow out long. I get a big bushy beard. I'm a total bushman, and that helps me a lot.
Exactly. It's an attitude.
Yep. But, most of our listeners, just like us, have full-time jobs. They might have a race on a Saturday, and they're usually traveling on the Friday.
And so with that in mind, it's just have had your relative rest. Sometimes folks, they do openers on the trainer in the morning before they leave and travel. Next morning, you're right at it. Let's go.
Something, if it's a long drive, something I will recommend to my athletes is either time it so that you can get there to do that spin, or if you can't, literally stop partway on the drive, get on the bike, do a spin.
I've been there before. Yep.
Do that 30-minute. I've pulled a trainer out in a parking lot randomly somewhere in the middle of nowhere and done 20 minutes with a couple little builds and throw it back in and continue on.
I did this in Wyoming before I understood Wyoming winds. My
did you
friend
face
and I
the correct way?
we were driving up the Cascades and got on the bikes. We're like, wow, we're going so fast. So we had planned an hour spin.
Whoops.
We went 25 minutes one way, and then it took us an hour 15 to get back.
Slogging too.
Going 8 miles an hour into the most unbelievable headwinds we had ever experienced in our lives.
Yeah, those can be absolutely amazing. So best on those days when you notice there is wind, head into the wind to start.
Yeah.
Yes.
Truth. Better to manage it that way.
Yes. We actually off mic for a minute because Rob was complaining that he's a little glycogen depleted, so he didn't do his prep work for this event. And I kid you not, Neal pulled a smaller bag out of the bag that he came with that had race food, various painkillers in case
no painkillers.
No, so what was it?
Benadryl in case you have an allergic reaction, you're going to die. We have Sudafed in case you have a sinus issue when you're on a plane. Those kind of headaches are the worst. It's another Sudafed.
They are bad.
And we got emergency or immune,
Yeah, got some food.
Scratch bar.
Got a bar. We got a bag of almonds. We've got earplugs so in case you forget your headphones or you have a snoring roommate. When you room with people you don't know, you're often going to need those. We got some hand sanitizer. We got Imodium if you have a bad GI issue. That's the other thing there. We have a packet of oatmeal. We have some lip balm, again, very dry. Have a toothbrush and toothpaste in there. Have some tissues. And most importantly, a small packet of Cholula.
Which can do anything for you. It can probably sanitize your water if you're drinking out of a hose.
It'll put you in a good headspace, too. If you've had bland food and you need to spice it up, you go to that Cholula. It's like, bam, I'm ready for anything.
All I can say is we have picked the perfect person for this episode because right there is his like prep for anything.
Be
bad.
ready. Yeah.
And
failure to plan is a plan to fail.
And
this backpack goes with me everywhere. When people pick it up, they're like, what do you have in there? I'm like, it's what I don't have in there, and it's nothing. I don't not have anything. I have everything I need to exist for at least a week in a foreign land. Money, coins, bills, all kinds of currency. I'm ready.
I was going to say, if we're ready to jump, are we ready to jump to takeaways?
We're ready to jump into our takeaways, and I think the takeaway is do as Neal does.
Plan.
Practice.
The guy planned so much, he took the travel bag to the preparation podcast recording because that's how much he plans.
You never know.
So, Neal, with that, do you have any more 1-minute takeaways, or have you demonstrated? Like, this is where your takeaway should just be drop the mic and walk out the room.
Drop the Cholula.
I think that says it all right there. Yeah, plan it out and be adaptable.
There we go. Rob, can we even touch this?
No, I got
give
nothing
it a try?
more. I have nothing more. It's the same for me. Plan ahead, be adaptable.
Okay. I am scared to touch any of this. I am just going to add the learn yourself, learn what works for you. You have to experiment, as you said. Use this at smaller events. Play with those 4 days, and then, come prepared. And I'm still shocked at what I'm looking at on the table here.
But not appalled, just shocked.
I think we have to take a picture of this, and we will put this on the website. Did you bring your phone down?
I have my phone. We'll do this as the
our takeaway is going to be a visual. We'll leave it at that. This is Neal has prepared for any possible situation in his race travel. This is amazing.
You should see what else is in the rest of my backpack.
That was another episode of Fast Talk. That was another episode of Fast Talk. Subscribe to Fast Talk wherever you prefer to find your favorite podcast. Be sure to leave us a rating and a review. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. As always, we love your feedback. Join the conversation at forums.fasttalklabs.com to discuss each and every episode. Become a member of Fast Talk Laboratories at fasttalklabs.com/join and become a part of our education and coaching community. For Neal Henderson, Tom Skoinch, Dr. Inigo San Milan, Dr. Patrick Wilson, Renee Eastman, Rebecca Gross, and Trevor Connor, I'm Rob Pickles. Thanks for listening.